Hi, everyone. I'm Karen from the International Biogeography Society, and in a couple minutes, Ole Vetaas, who is a board member of the society, will be talking about elevational gradients in mountain biodiversity, which is part of a special issue for Frontiers of Biogeography. Frontiers of Biogeography is the society journal, and the latest issue of which is the special issue. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it already, then I encourage you to do so. And there's some really great articles in there. And while we fill in time waiting for people to finish connecting, I'm just going to go over some upcoming conferences that we've got up. The first is not the most recent, but Vancouver in January of 2022 is our 10th biennial conference, and it's going to be hybrid. So there are the chance to attend virtually and the chance to attend in person, which is super exciting because Vancouver is gorgeous. So join us if you can, and check out the meeting website for symposia, invited speakers, that sort of thing. Registration and abstract submission is now open. And then in October, coming up very soon, is our Early Career Biogeographers Conference. And most speakers, I believe, are online for that. There's a little shifting around, but everybody who has submitted an abstract should be up and viewable as a speaker. So I encourage you to check that one out too. There's some really great talks that should be fascinating to listen to. And that meeting is virtual. And with that, I will turn it over to Rob, who will introduce our speaker for the day. Thanks. Rob, it is over to you.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Rob Whittaker, and I'm Chief Editor of Frontiers of Biogeography. And it's my privilege today to introduce Ole Vetaas, our speaker. Ole is a Professor of Biogeography in the Department of Geography at the University of Bergen, Norway. He lives in a place where you come to appreciate the significance of liquid water, and that at times you can have an excess of it that is more than you need for ecological systems to function. He's worked extensively on patterns and processes of species diversity and how they vary with scale of analysis, from local scale patterns that may link to succession and disturbance theory, up to coarser scale patterns that evidence the interaction of the energy regime of a place with the water regime. He has used elevational gradients as model systems for exploring these ideas and for testing and developing models of species diversity, publishing widely, and in particular building up a research program of some substance focused on these issues and themes for the Himalayas, one of the most fascinating areas in the world biogeographically. Some months ago, Ole made a proposal to me for a special issue of Frontiers of Biogeography focusing on mountains and elevational gradients, which he subsequently oversaw, and which makes up the current issue of the journal. And that's why I have the privilege today of introducing Ole to give the Funk lecture. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ole.
So this should be okay, isn't it? If
Looks
not,
good.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you for the introduction. So this will be a Funk lecture presenting a special issue in Frontiers of Biogeography. And my name is Ole Vetaas, and the title of this special issue is Elevational Gradients and Mountain Biodiversity. So the schedule here will be that I want to actually demonstrate that these temperature elevation gradients are superior in natural in situ experimental sites. So the first 1/3 or 1/4 of the time, I will spend some time on explaining gradients. What is a gradient? Why are elevational gradients so special? And some theoretical and methodological issues around that. After that, I will present the different papers. So first, So this is one of my favorite illustrations, which illustrate the biome sonation from the tropical areas towards the temperate and boreal zone into the Arctic. And if you happen to be in a big mountain in the tropics or in the subtropics, even warm temperate, you will have a quite similar zonation of evergreen forest and deciduous forest and boreal coniferous forest and the alpine zone in the top. In this way, you can say that the biome zonation is mimicking the latitudinal gradient in biomes. However, for instance, there are no desert here in my illustrations, so there are, of course, things that are different. But this is driven by the simultaneously a change in temperature, whether you go from the lowland to the highland or from the tropics towards the polar areas, the temperature will decrease. And so will also the moisture availability. So this is a formula then the lapse rate, that is the temperature decrease with elevation, which is roughly 0.5 degrees per 100 meter. And sometimes it depends a bit on the humidity of the air. So if it's very moist, the decrease is less, and it's very dry, the decrease is a bit higher. This is an elevational gradient or a temperature gradient, which is really special because it's very gradual and it's continuous and it's linear, this change in temperature. So this is a perfect example of environmental gradient. So what should we expect along such a gradient? Such a gradient will have a unimoral response in species where, like the illustration here, the green species, Gallium odoratum, will sort of have a peak somewhere around 5 degrees or something like that. And it will decrease towards the cold and towards the warmer areas. Of course, if you go in a much smaller mountain, then there may be some species which are more linear, decreasing or increasing. So this phenomenon I will come back to a bit later. So this is just to really formalize this unimodal response of all types of organisms along an environmental gradient, where there is an optimum in the middle and a sort of more or less symmetric decrease to the low, warm areas in this case, or high, the cold area, if you look at environmental gradient in a mountain. However, the environmental gradient can be constructed with a regression, for instance, and from sampling units from all over a region or the whole planet, or you follow a certain spatial change in geography, like the elevation gradient. So sometimes I have experienced by referees and editors, and when I say I will use a theoretical basement is the theory of gradient analysis, then some may object and say, well, this is not a theory, and maybe an hypothesis or a model. Well, I will argue that the gradient and the unimoral response is part of a theory of gradient analysis, where the continual concepts is central. This development of this theory started in the America with Curtis and Bray, the Bray-Curtis distance measure, for instance. They were all linked up to ordination techniques, and this was taken on by the late Whittaker, not our local Whittaker here, but also the Australian Mike Austin took this further. And if you think a theory, if it should really be a theory, it should have some numerical backing and a basis where you can formulate it totally mathematical. Then this was done completely by Chabrak and Prentice in 1988 in this paper, Advances in Ecological Research. In biogeography, similar ideas have actually appeared. So for instance, Hangewell and Hack, they published something on gradient and unimodal responses done in two-dimensional spatial areas like distribution areas. And Brown came into the similar ideas in 1984, published in Journal of Biogeography. And they look at spatial gradients, not along elevation actually. Well, it's good reason why elevation gradients are so special is because they will have this continuous change in temperature. And if you look at that nice book by Lomolino and Sachs and Brown, The Foundation of Biogeography, one of the papers there is by Whittaker and his gradient analysis of vegetation, which this whole figure here is an illustration of. So, gradient theory exists. It's not just an idea. So then when you look at an elevation gradient, you have the chance to interpolate species richness, because if you have the maximum and the minimum of a species, and you have many species, so you also have maximum and minimum, you can interpolate this and see where it piles up, and then you can count the species richness by interpolation. And two papers I will present later have used this technique. So before I leave the sort of theoretical issue here about gradients, I sometimes hear that there people use the concept gradient about species gradient, species richness gradient. For instance, for the latitudinal biodiversity gradient. So this figure here to the left is latitudinal patterns of biodiversity, vascular plants. And if you focus on the graph in the middle here and flip it around, so you actually have the response in species richness along the y-axis, and then we have the, the latitude here in the x-axis. So if we start there in Equatorial Africa and go north, the species richness, the black figure here, graph will decrease because there will be less available water and the temperature will actually increase. Then we go further up to the Mediterranean area and the species richness will increase. And then if you go further north towards Norway, it will decrease again. So this is not a gradient. This is a species response, species richness response to climate. Because this is not continuous linear. And this is what I would say is not an environmental variable. So to me, strictly a gradient is an environmental variable as temperature. So then to the various papers. So I have given a little editorial in this special issue, which is actually what I base some of this my talk today. And then there is an introductory paper by John Burks, who loved alpine plants. And he actually gave a very nice talk about von Humboldt and the various high elevation limits of vascular plants last year in the von Humboldt week. This paper, this presentation, he has now written up, and it's one of the papers, the first paper in this special issue. Then we have 6 sort of research papers, and I could just tell you where they are located here in this biome map. First one is with the first author, Di Musciano. The Italian group is from the Apulian Alps in Italy. Then you have actually my group with Bhatta as the first author from the Himalayas. There is another paper, Devan is the first author from Sikkim on butterflies. Then we have one from the Americas, from Ecuador up to through Mesoamerica into Mexico with Hernandez Reyes. And then we have a paper from La Palma, one of the Canary Islands, currently with an active volcano. They look at plant co-occurrences. And then we have a paper on Hemanoptera from Mount Kilimanjaro. So the special issue papers are actually representing all the continents except Australia. So, as I said, John Burks have written up a paper based on his talk from last year in the Humboldt Week. It's called A Humboldt Legacy, High Elevation Limits and Ecology of Vascular Plants. So there have, of course, been piling up a lot of information about alpine plants and distribution because of all the explorations. And John has sort of tried to compile this up in this paper. And here it is illustrated in something we may call a kernel diagram. This is a diagram where you have the green line here is the tree line or the forest line. The yellow one is the alpine zone, and the blue is actually the mountains. So there are 22 different regions he have taken records from. So for instance, here 11 and 12 must be in the Himalayas. So I cannot, of course, present all these 22 different regions and all the funny and special records there. But I have picked out one I really love, the Saxifraga oppositifolia, one of my favorite alpine plants. It has the record in North America, highest plant, and it also has a record in the earth. It grows in the coldest place where you actually have plant growth. So from this and the niche conservatism theory, one may say, one should expect a lot of Saxifraga to have all kinds of height records, but they do not. But I take this up, and it's actually not a monophyletic genus. It has different origins, so that's probably can explain why only a few of them has some very high records when it comes to mountain environment. Another thing John highlights from this paper is that there has recently been discovered something called snow roots. Plants in the alpine zone have this dilemma. It's a very short growing season, and when the growing season starts, it's actually a lot of water. So, and there's a lot of time when the water is just melting, and some plants have actually developed roots which actually can penetrate water from snow. And this is quite amazing and quite recently discovered. Then we have the Italian group, where Professor Chiarocchi is the senior author, and Di Musciano is the first author, and Zanini is the corresponding author. The title of their paper is Investigating Elevational Gradients of Species Richness in a Mediterranean Plant Hotspot, using a published flora, as I earlier mentioned, interpolation of species richness. So Upper Alps is here, and what do they find? Yeah, the native species decrease in a rather curvilinear to linear fashion. The endemic species has a peak around 1200 meters and decrease towards the lowland and towards the high alpine zone, which is actually a confirmation of a global pattern. The alien species is decreasing towards the mountain, luckily enough. And they have also splitted all these species into different round-shell life forms, which today maybe is better called functional traits. Nevertheless, they have various kinds of responses. So some are linear and some are unimodal. Then another paper who used the same sort of approach to interpolate based on flora and enumeration data is this from Himalayas, my group, so to speak, where Bhatta is the first author and Robson and Suval take care of child-side climate data and the estimation of primary production by remote sensing. We have done a pan-Himalayan test of predictions on plant species richness based on primary production and water energy dynamics. We have 6 sectors along the Himalayan range, political sectors, and we have data from each of them. And we try to compare net primary production and the water energy dynamics, and we want to evaluate it by a Keiko information criteria. Primary production simply predict a linear increase in biodiversity. The water energy dynamics predict a linear increase as a function of precipitation, with the unimodal response as a function of potentially evapotranspiration. So the net primary production actually explain a lot of the deviance or variance, though it's more like a curvilinear more than a straight linear, except maybe here in Uttarakhand. So we have not rejected net primary production. The potential evapotranspiration predict a unimodal response, and as you can see on the left curves here, they are both on herbs and total species and woody species. They all look very unimodal. Then to the precipitation prediction, which should be a linear increase in species richness. This was not so true, except maybe again here in Uttarakhand. It seems that species richness actually respond more unimodally to precipitation than linearly for all kinds of herbs and woody species. But if we compare these two, we can see here in the middle, they both explain a high percentage of the deviance of these data. So both models are good. But by using a Keiko information criteria, we can also see that the water energy dynamics is much better than net primary production. We had a lot of discussion with the referees, and which meant that the water energy dynamics was just another reflection of net primary production. We didn't really agree to that. We think that the net primary production is a biological variable, and we are it's sort of a biological variable predicting something biological like species richness. Then we think water energy dynamics is better because you have independent factors. So WED explains species richness based on the first principle of thermodynamics, which makes it scientifically a better model. Then another Himalayan study, this time on butterflies, and Acaraya is the corresponding author here, and they have not used interpolation, they have used proper empirical data, and they asked the question, do subgroups of butterflies display different elevational distributions patterns in the Eastern Himalaya, India? This is the sampling sites, and they have actually 16 different transects with traps to get data on these butterflies. So what do they find? First, we look at the elevational pattern as such, and the different different columns here show different ways of estimating species richness, and the different rows are different groups, either by geographical or taxonomic. So as we can see, they are more or less a linear response to elevation, except from some small accepted Palearctic or Regionade, maybe different. They also used an environmental variable. They did not use potentially evapotranspiration, but they use actual evapotranspiration based on a Turk formula, which is highly influenced by precipitation, which again confirms the importance of water availability for butterfly richness as well as composition. Then there is something we should keep in mind, richness and scale. because as you saw, the group from Sikkim has a very linear trend for all the different groups, and the Italian group as well, quite linear change in species richness, although these are 2,500 or 2,000 meter. But this is from Nepal. The response is very unimodal, and the range is very long. And I will highlight this because this is one of David Nogues Bravo breakthrough paper from 2008 in Nature, that richness and scale are very much determining whether it's a unimodal or linear trend in richness, worthwhile keeping in mind. Then we have a different group, Kessler's and Kluge's group. Hernandez Reyes is the first author. She did her PhD on this paper and other papers. This is from the Americas. The title of their paper is Phylogenetic Diversity of Ferns Reveals Different Patterns of Niche Conservatism and Habitat Filtering Between Epiphytic and Terrestrial Assemblages. So the other paper already presented has focused on climate and various and functional traits in the beginning, but also the not primary production, but nothing about evolution. But if you think on the long run, the actual species richness will depend on speciation and extinction and migration. So this paper is also looking at evolution and the diversification among ferns. So this is a quite unique paper because it had 11 different elevation gradients, all the way from Colombia in the south through the Mesoamerica up to subtropical Mexico. And they look at both climate as well as evolution. And as you can see to these graphs to the right, that the epiphytes has a clear response, but the terrestrial ferns has not, when you look at different climatic variables. So this was quite surprising to me, and it's interesting to read how they explain it. When it comes to the phylogeny, the phylogenetically early divergent lineages are tropical, whereas the phylogenetically young lineages are widespread. So this is more the consensus today. So then we have a group from La Palma, one of the Canary Islands. As I said, the island with the active volcano. Important to highlight here is that this is a spin-off from the science school in La Palma, which is led by Carl Biogeography and Anke Jetsch. Here, Severin Earle is the senior author and Ibis is the first author. And they look at vegetation and co-occurrence frequency in vegetation patches, decreasing towards the harsh edge along an arid volcano elevation gradient. So, elevation gradients is nice and even nicer when they are on islands, because then you have a semi-closed species pool. And in addition, they have sampled in very homogeneous soil, namely volcano-tephra. So this is really an in situ experimental study in a way. And this is where the active volcano is, more or less. According to the stress gradient hypothesis, the role of positive interaction between species, that is what we call facilitation, is expected to increase with harshness. They actually reject this hypothesis. And as you can see in this graph, they find that the number of individuals per patch increased with elevation towards the ecologically more favorable end of the gradient. But for the audience, this may sound a bit strange. High elevation have low temperature, So that should be harsh, shouldn't it? But in these islands, this oceanic island, where the trade winds bring clouds, as you can see in this picture, down to the left, the higher up you come, that's more moisture is available. So it makes sense that there is more facilitation among plants at higher elevation. Then we have a different paper about Hemanoptera. This is Peter's group, who have made a lot of papers from Mount Kilimanjaro. Meyer is the first author. They look at seasonal variation in the ecology of tropical cave nesting Hemanoptera on Mount Kilimanjaro. They have made a lot of nests placed out, and they have 4 clear hypotheses. One of the most obvious is that they want to see where is the seasonal variation most important, in the highland or in the lowland. So what they find is that these cave nesting Hemanoptera show very clear seasonal patterns in the choline zone, that is the lowland. And patterns were more, the patterns were more common in the lowland, the choline zone, and these patterns were actually connected to the climatic condition, which again control the flora availability. So it all makes perfectly sense. Then I will try to make a sort of conclusion. I think the papers show that extensive temperature elevation gradients on large mountain ranges are excellent in situ natural experimental sites. And the studies demonstrate the importance of both thermal energy as such and thermal energy as a regulator of liquid water, the core vital resource for biodiversity. So I will encourage you to read papers in this special issue because they elucidate the scientific and biodiversity thresholds found in these investigated global hotspots, where most of them have extraordinary biodiversity. And there is represent deep time evolutionary history, which may be worthwhile preserving in this area of rapid global changes. So then it's just for me to say thank you to all the authors and to Rob, who was the editor-in-chief, Karen Faller for her technical assistance, and to you that have been listening. So now there will be time for questions and comments. And I hope some of the authors may actually want to reply on the comments. Or maybe they have some comments to my presentations of their paper. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hi there, I'm Anke, and I'm very impressed with this overview. Ole, I really appreciate it. I'm one of the authors of the paper from La Palma on facilitation gradients. And I just want to share the insight that I have after looking at the various elevational studies. This is that we are so focused on global warming issues when we talk about climate change. And usually our initial thought is to take these elevational gradients as temperature gradients. And according to the papers that Ole suggested, but also our own findings, it's really a central issue that the change in another resource, which is precipitation, seems to be so crucial, so that the elevational gradient might even stronger stand for water resource gradients and increased or decreased water variability than the temperature gradient itself. And that makes it challenging and interesting. And I wonder how to quantify the favorability of the site across these elevational gradients when looking for more than temperature gradients. That's a metric challenge.
Yes, should I? Thank you, Anke. Sorry, you're written on here. Nevertheless, I totally agree with what you said. I think the main problem with climate change is actually the change in precipitation patterns and how water will be available for all kinds of organisms. But as we wrote in that paper from Himalayas, actually, we saw that this linear increase in species richness towards precipitation didn't really look like that. So the problem with elevation gradients is that the rainfall will fall in one place and it will be absorbed and drank by animals maybe many kilometers, miles away from where it falls down. So, and here again, in those oceanic islands, if you look at precipitation, and then it will actually be high at the top, and the richness is quite low. So the richness and precipitation there doesn't really follow a linear pattern. It's the other way around, actually. It's just illustrate how difficult it is to estimate the availability of water. I did my PhD study in such an area where there was fog from the ocean and trade wind as well, north in Sudan. And this moves into the vegetation and it drips down. So how to quantify that? And I know students in the Palma Science School have tried to quantify that with various success, but it's a big challenge to get some idea of what actually is available to the organisms under a certain precipitation regime. It's easy here in Bergen, as Rob said in the beginning in the introduction. We have excess of water, but when the water is in scarcity, like in arid areas, then it's not easy to know what is available to the different organisms. But just to look at the precipitation, because there's so many other things which actually influence it. So I also
thanks.
I was inspired by your. This is a big challenge.
We jointly emphasize that altitudinal gradients is kind of much more than temperature gradients represented.
Yes.
That's the challenge that we all face.
And then you have the water availability and temperature, and then you have, of course, you have the soil, which will vary. Yeah.
So I think that Janet Franklin as well put some comments related with what you were discussing. She says, thank you so much for emphasizing water, Anna. That really resonates with patterns in California, semi-arid, water limited, and topographically complex. So, and she as well added here, saying, climatic water balance is one way to quantify that. I think that this was linked with when you were mentioning, Ole, about how to quantify, and you were talking about the fog, etc. So.
Yeah, and it just illustrates a similar thing. I think it's, I don't know where in California, I can't remember that, but California was one of the places people really found that plants responded to climate change by moving down. We found it, that a similar thing in Nepal, that was land use maybe. But here in California, it was actually the water availability was better at a low elevation. And they hypothesized that the reason why plants have moved down with time was the actual water availability. So yeah, now it's complicated. I think if the climate change was a linear change in temperature, there will be less of a problem, because then we can model and arrange many things according to that. But it's much more than that, particularly the change in water regimes.
Mm-hmm. She mentions Adigua Santa Rosa Mountain in California.
And again, you have, and I didn't mention it earlier, but because snow falls down at 4,000 meters, for instance, and then it melts and go directly to a river, and maybe there is a rhino or some grasses at 500 meters who actually get that water.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Manjur, do you want to say anything, any question? Because you have the hand call. Yes.
Yeah. Great talk, Professor Ole. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, for example, when we are asking a question along an elevational gradient, right? So, for example, we lay a transect from the lower elevation to the middle and to the higher, with something in mind that probably largely many other things remain the same, but only the elevation changes, and because of that, temperature and the precipitation pattern changes, right? If, for example, I mean, we had a practical, for example, difficulty. You want to look at the grassland, for instance, dynamics along the elevational gradient. But once we look at in one site along the elevation, we don't find much variation. But in the other transect, we find that variation. So do we consider it as an altitudinal gradient, or how do we reconcile with those, between transect variations along an elevation?
There will always be a change in temperature. So there is an environmental gradient, whatever. But for instance, vegetation may look a bit similar if there's high land use control of the vegetation. So it is a sort of anthropogenic cultural landscape. Will look a bit more similar, even if there's a big difference in temperature, for instance. But since the change in temperature is given by the decrease in pressure, air pressure, so there will always be a change in temperature.
Right.
So there is a gradient, but it may be, for organisms, it may be masked because there is a high influence of grazing animals or other factors.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. So we have some questions on the question and answer box. The first one is from Ting Wen Shen, and I'm going to read it right now. So it says, thank you for the definition about the gradient. And the question follows saying, would you think that the elevational gradient is simply a gradient of temperature or a gradient with mixed environmental factors? That would be the first one. Then the second question, okay. Do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, I take this first. This is, since I mentioned the old and late Whittaker from America. He would have classified the elevation gradient as a complex gradient. So there is temperature, there is precipitation, and there is, of course, then soil, which will vary, which then again control the primary production. So there are many things which may vary. So the humus layer will maybe increase with higher temperature, maybe lower temperature, and a lot of minerals will change when you go from the lowland to the highland. So it's what we call a complex gradient.
Mm-hmm. And the second bit of the question goes related with that and says, would the definition of gradient change depending on the taxa in focus, for example, other organisms than plants? And says, as there may be more factors than temperature to affect species distribution, those patterns of biodiversity. Would you think the gradient itself better to be presented as principal component axis, which can summarize multiple collinear factors? Thank you. So a bit of a double, triple question. Do you want me to? I can reread the first bit when the question focus on would the definition of gradient change depending on the taxa in focus?
No. No. And that is the unique thing. Unique thing. Sorry, for this gradient and the responses. All organisms are supposed to have a unimodal, skewed in one way or the other, but it will peak somewhere, and then there is a decrease to the extreme ends of any environmental variable which change linearly. And this can be constructed with sampling different places, or it's sometimes like in front of a glacier or a seashore or elevation, as focusing here, there will be a spatial change, which is very obvious. But gradient can then be also constructed by regressions, by sampling anywhere, and then look at these responses. So so that's unique. There will be a peak in some places, and then it will decrease, whether this is skewed or unimodal or platycurpic, whatever responses, but there's a peak somewhere, and there's some limits in the end. I highlight this because this was basic knowledge for vegetation ecologists in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and now in the next millennium century, this knowledge have a bit evaporated, and that's not good because this is a basic and fundamental fact we know, and there's theoretical foundation for it.
Brilliant, thank you. we have more questions here. Janet Franklin as well. So she says, thank you for this presentation of a fantastic special issue, and indeed for proposing and organizing it. Can you discuss what you think are the research horizons in this area? I was particularly interested in the ideas in many papers about teasing apart water and energy effects on elevation gradients. She opens brackets and said, I come from an arid region, as well as a phylogenetic approach used with the ferns in the Americas. And well, let me just keep going a little bit, because I think that the second bit of the question will help answering this one.
Yeah, I mean, Adriana Arroyos was supposed to join us, and if she has...
She is here, and she can't share her video, but she is happy to answer questions, I think.
Go on.
So I'm going to allow her to talk. We can hear you, but we can't see you, and that's okay. You said you had a problem with video.
So I'm hearing guys questions. I don't know what I cannot activate my video. Yeah. Okay. She's interested in the phylogenetic approach. Does she wrote something more?
So in the second bit of the question,
Yeah.
she says, re-asking the second part of my complicated question.
Yeah.
I found the phylogenetic patterns analyzed in the fern study very interesting. Do you think this is useful area for additional research when looking at biodiversity patterns and elevation gradients?
Oh, yeah, I will say this region is very interesting. It's because we were including the tropics area from 0 degrees to the subtropical areas in Mexico. And this is very exciting for me. I mean, I'm working with the ferns, but I think it's very exciting for other researchers. So I will invite people that are interested to test in another groups questions. It's really exciting zone because the diversity there. Also the conditions, it is possible to work there. I don't know what other things to say. Yeah, the phylogenetic patterns in the groups can be different. So in the case of ferns, we found this, what you can read in the paper. But in trees, for example, the patterns are opposite. It depends of the group of plants or animals that you want to test there. But of course, I will say, yeah, you should really try to do research in this area of transitions. That is one of the, includes many hotspots of biodiversity, or Mesoamerica is, for example, considered a hotspot of biodiversity for ferns and for other groups. So I don't know if there are more things written in the question.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, I would say they are welcome to study there. So the plots also are there. But yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Adriana.
Maybe I should just add,
Yeah.
phylogeny is not my main cup of tea, but
Yeah.
I like it. Anyway. Now, in elevation gradients, both in Himalayas and in Andes, there has been publication who shows that the old genera is not necessarily in the lowland. They're actually in the middle of this of the zonation. And also when you go very high up, then suddenly very old families appear. So when you look at this, the mean phylogenetic age of different groups like genera or families,
yeah,
they are not necessarily in the warm tropical zone in somewhere in Andes and in Himalayas. I don't say you show that was the consensus in your study there, but there have been some exceptions. Dr. Hong Quinn from Missouri, he has a few papers on this issue, and we have one and I have one together with him from Nepal. would show something similar.
Yeah.
But you know, in India and Nepal, it's a bit special because there have been coalition and various things has happened. But it shows that the idea that the old families or genera are in the warm tropics are correct, but there are also some exceptions.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I only want to mention that in this case of ferns, so it's very interesting. So I was very excited to test this hypothesis of out of the tropics hypothesis, and what we found is that the tropical families, the tropics. That was very nice because usually we are as ecologists or biogeographers. I mean, as ecologists, we are also only working with sometimes a level of plot. There is not the opportunity to include more studies, but in this case, because we have the data of the Kessler group, and we also generate our own data from Mexico, we had the opportunity to see, to compare transects from the equator to the north of Mexico in a subtropical area. So it was very interesting to see, at least in this group in ferns, this is a useful group to work in biogeographical studies. So we found like what is happening towards this subtropical area, all phylogenetical, all their lineages disappear, so they are only in the tropics. I remember that I received a comment where they say, maybe we are living in Mexico, we are seeing with ferns, so we saw that other tropical families are also present in the northernmost transect. And that's true, but they are declining. So there are more. You put attention in the figure. There are more lineages in the equator, for example, more that are disappearing or are present in the subtropical areas, but with a market declining. So maybe, as I told you, this is a pattern exclusive for ferns. Ferns are the lineages. Many lineages are more ancient than some angiosperms. In angiosperms, maybe you can find another patterns, but it's really interesting to do to study this in a big scale to see what is happening in other groups.
Okay, so we still have 2 more questions in the question and answer box. The first one is from Suresh Rana, and he said, well, my question to Ole, because freezing should affect the whole clades under the preview of niche conservatism, what is the role of freezing in shaping communities along the elevation gradient?
communities, yes, no. The role of freezing is that it kills. So that's why I think the uppermost limits of some species are much more absolute in the highland, when it's actually the frost who sets the limit. So yeah, whereas in the lowland and the lower limit for species will be much more indirect. It's warm, but you do not die from heat necessarily. You die from lack of water, number one, but pathogens, other species, competition from other species, and not at least what I said, pathogens. We don't do much on this, we biographers, but you get diseases in the warm tropical, subtropical zone. So yes, to your question, yeah, temperature and frost is very important to set the upper limit of species. So that will influence species assemblies. And if you call them community, okay. But that there are more absolute limits than the warm limits, which is, I guess, will be indirect. I hope this answers some of the ideas in the question.
Anke, did you?
And Anke has a comment.
If I may, I just want to add to the same topic, just one thought. because we also do warming experiments. And the insight here is now back to the altitudinal gradient being a temperature gradient. If there are increasing warm spells in mid-elevations, then of course the sensitivity increases for late frost events. And I think that is a research frontier with respect to climate change and elevational gradients, because we have not really understood that a couple of days in physiological development or in leaf out exposing sensitive tissue can make a severe difference when there are late frost events that are usually not connected to winter regimes. Very often these are disturbances that are unexpected, and there's not much of evolutionary adaptation there already. So that's an interesting issue in the future when it's getting warmer at these cold limited areas.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point. And I have one study on the commercial agricultural plant wheat in Himalayas. And there we found that we thought that climate change, better temperature, there will be higher production. Yes, that was okay when the wheat was in slopes. But those farmers who planted their wheat in the bottom of a U valley, for instance, they had exactly what Anke mentioned, the spring early frost events, which kills, even if the mean temperature is higher, because you are lower down in the main valley. All the wheat production in the bottom of the valley was destroyed by spring frost, which was not supposed to take place higher up. So that's the detail here. I mean, as I said, well, the elevation will always be correlated with decrease in temperature, but you have this phenomenon, inversion. And so in the Alps also, you have some valleys where you will have an opposite elevation gradient in temperature because you have these fern winds from Africa. And so it's complicated. And this old saying, plants doesn't die from mean temperature. No, they die from special events like spring frost. So then we go into the details. Like Kernel had done a lot of studies on this in the Alps to show that, okay, mean values are important in big biogeographical sort of explanation of biogeographical distribution. But if you actually want to say what actually stop a certain number of plants, then certainly there are special events like spring frost. So we do agree. Okay.
We're at 11 o'clock, Sandra. I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, and we have only one left, so that's good timing. We have a question from Prakash, and starts like, thank you, Ole, for this presentation. As you compare WED and NPP hypotheses and present what better explains the variance on the data, but don't you think that WED is simple and explain only the variation on water energy parameters, but NPP is complex and include all the physical, open brackets, water, energy, nutrients, etc., and biological factors like interaction, physiology of individual species, facilitation, etc. So my question is, though, what better explains the variation of the data? Don't you think that NPP is better model?
No. No, I can elaborate my explanation in the middle of the presentation. The water energy dynamics has an advance compared to net primary production, because we want to explain something biological, that is the species richness or biodiversity. Then we can explain that with net primary production. That is also a biological variable. So then you're explaining something biological with a biological variable. So they are not really indirect. if you use net primary production to maybe explain butterflies or frogs, or then they are more indirect, because the primary production will be plants. But particularly when you want to explain the richness in plants, then net primary production is scientifically not so a good variable, because it's actually part of the phenomenon you're actually predicting. Then the water energy dynamics go back to the first principle of thermodynamics, the change of water from gas to liquid water to ice. So you really use the basics to explain species richness. And this is one of the reasons why it has been so good and have been a good predictor in many studies. So for what I wrote in the paper, I think maybe it was taken up by some editors, but I wrote once that if net primary production is the main principal explanatory variable for biodiversity or species richness, then the next question naturally will be, what controls net primary production? And then you will have to look at water, and you have to look at the energy. So that is a sort of scientific explanation why I think one is better than the other. In my case, or our case in Himalayas, they both explain 95 or 6% or 85%. So they're both good models, but one is more basic than the other.
So I think that
Yeah,
no more questions.
That was a good end, wasn't it? Because this is my main point.
Thank you so much for everybody to pasting questions on the question and answer in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Ole, a huge thank you from both the Society and the journal for
Yeah, thank you. Likewise.
Absolutely.
And thank you to all the authors as well. And Rob, always thank you for editor-in-chief, and Janet, I know you're online somewhere, but thank you both for all the work that you do. So this video will be available, it's being recorded, it will be available probably early next week online on the YouTube channel, and also on the What We Offer webinars website of the Society. Ole, there was a question from somebody in the audience asking about your slides, basically, if you could make those slides available, and I wasn't sure what the answer to that was.
Yeah, I think I saw that in the chat box, and it's totally correct what you say. They are all available in the papers, with some exceptions. Some of them I may not dare to give away because they may not. There's a few from textbooks, a few.
Okay.
But for those who wonder, if you go on the net, you will find the papers, and then you will find the figures. And if you don't find exactly the figure you're looking for, then you may actually just mail me.
So I guess the answer to that is no, but you can find it via talking to.
Yeah, you find them in the papers.
In the papers, yeah.
They're probably a figure from Thompson and
So just to add to what Ole is saying there, the papers in Frontiers of Biogeography are freely available to download for everybody. There's no restriction on downloading them, and we're an open access, really a platinum open access journal in that we're not a profit-making organization. It is supported by the IBS financially. And although we ask authors to contribute to some of the costs of publication, if they have funding, if authors don't have funding, it's entirely free to publish with the journal. So maybe I could just wrap up today by thanking everybody for staying with the session all the way through. And I'd like to thank the authors of all the papers, and especially and particularly Ole for leading the presentation today. Many years ago, I did my PhD in the mountains of central Norway, And I once was sitting outside my tent working, and a strange man came over the glacier fall and landscape, and came up to me, he said, "Dr. Whittaker, I've come to see your permit." And this was a great shock to me because I didn't think we needed a permit. And it turned out he was a botany professor from Oslo, and he was just pulling my leg, which Scandinavians can do very subtly without you realizing. And I said, "Oh, are you here doing research in the mountains?" He said, No, I don't. We don't work up here. I'm just on holiday." So it's great to see that Scandinavian botanists and biogeographers are working in the mountains and doing such great stuff. Thank you very much, Ole. Thanks, everybody.
Likewise.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.